Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Kevin Robert Frost, the Chief Executive Officer here at amfAR, the Foundation for AIDS Research. Every minute a person dies of AIDS-related causes, and 3 more become infected with the virus. So there's still much work to be done. Today, December 1st, is World AIDS Day. And to mark the occasion, my colleagues and I are going to talk about the critical challenges we face and how amfAR plans to address those challenges in the coming months and years. We're calling this conversation Priorities and the Path to Progress. And to discuss the path forward, we have Vice President and Director of Research, Dr. Rowena Johnston, the Vice President and Director of our Public Policy Program in Washington, D.C., Greg Millett, and joining us from Bangkok, Thailand, is Dr. Annette Sohn, the Vice President and Director of the Treat Asia Program. Thank you again for being here, and let's go ahead and jump right in. So, Rowena, let's start with you. Obviously, the goal of the research is to get to a cure. What's holding us back? What is it that we don't know?
You know, we've made so many strides with HIV. As you know, we can treat HIV really very well. But the problem is that when people are on treatment, even if their viral levels are suppressed, there are cells throughout people's bodies. Mostly they're in lymph nodes, inguinal lymph nodes, maybe in their gut, possibly in their brain. And collectively we call these cells the reservoir. And that reservoir stays seemingly no matter how long you take antiretroviral therapy. So what we really need to know is, how do we get to those reservoirs? How do we eliminate them and thereby cure people? They are fairly silent. There's nothing about these cells that seems to distinguish them from other cells in the body, so there's no real easy way to track where they are, how many of them there are. And so really the challenge is to work out, how can we either boost up the immune system to get rid of them, or directly go in there and get the virus out of those cells so that we can cure people.
Why is it that the drugs we currently have can't do that? Why can't they reach those cells?
The drugs that are antiretroviral therapy that people living with HIV are taking, they rely on the virus being active. And if the virus is just in the cell being silent, just laying around doing nothing, then those drugs don't have a target to act against. And there's just nothing for them to do.
So how is amfAR attacking the problem through our research grants?
Yeah, we have a number of grants all around the world, grantees who are trying different approaches. There are ways that you could boost the immune system. See if you can beef up the immune system to do a better job of getting rid of those cells. We have grantees who are looking for ways to use gene therapy, for example. We really think that gene therapy is a really promising approach. There are new technologies emerging all the time, and there are really great ways that we could think about using gene therapy to get at HIV. We've heard of CAR T cells in cancer, for example. Fantastically successful in a number of different cancers. Let's see if we can do something about HIV using CAR T cells. We have a number of grantees trying that. We could use other types of immune cells, natural killer cells, macrophages. We've got grantees trying that. What about using gene therapy to go in and just cut out specifically the HIV out of the infected cells? We've got grantees trying that.
Gene editing, in other words.
Gene editing. Another thing, we've talked about taking function out of cells, like cutting the HIV out. You can actually add function in. We could add to a cell its ability to make antibodies, so that any virus that comes out will be killed by the antibodies. And finally, you can take function out, you can add function in, but you can also change the function of something that's already there. And we've got grantees covering that too.
So we're funding research in all of these avenues?
All of them.
Is there one in particular that you're particularly excited about?
I think everybody has come to the conclusion, I think most people agree, that we're going to need a combination. So I think if we could work out how to do all 3 of those things simultaneously, that might end up being a really great answer.
That's terrific. Greg, let me turn to you for a minute and let's talk about social and behavioral research if we can. What's happening on the domestic front?
Domestically, there are some exciting things that are afoot. in terms of making sure that people who are living with HIV remain on therapies, as well as people who are taking pre-exposure prophylaxis remain on
PrEP.
therapies. PrEP. And why that's important is because CDC data has shown that people who are living with HIV, most of us who are living with HIV are not sustainably virally suppressed. We're only virally suppressed in one point or period of time. The problem with that is because it could mean greater risk for transmission to partners. It can mean less health for a person living with HIV over a period of time. And we need to make sure that people are sustainably virally suppressed. The same thing with pre-exposure prophylaxis. People who take PrEP, they take PrEP for anywhere from 3 months to 6 months, and then they drop out of PrEP. And why that's important is if you are not on PrEP, if you're exposed to HIV, you have a greater likelihood of getting HIV. So we need to make sure that people who are on these therapies are on them for a sustained period of time. And there's some really interesting things that have been taking place with long-acting agents that are out there right now, which are essentially injectables that keep these medications in your bloodstream for a longer period of time. But there's two issues with them. One is whether or not they're going to be affordable. That's going to be one of the big issues that we are going to see in terms of making sure that they're available for people who are at risk for HIV or living with HIV. And I think the second issue as well is making sure that people actually know that they're available for them. That we have this new armamentarium to fight HIV that people have access to. So we need social marketing not only for people at risk and living with HIV, but we also need social marketing with providers to make sure that they're prescribing these medications.
So just take the PrEP question for a second, if you will. How are we doing domestically here in the U.S. in terms of getting PrEP to people who should be on it?
We're doing much better than we had been. It's been a very slow start over the last decade in making sure that we've had PrEP available for individuals who need it. The problem is, again, that we're still not getting PrEP to those regions that need it the most. So, for instance, there was a study that just took place that found that the place where we see HIV rates the highest, where you need a preventative like PrEP, in the southern United States, precisely are the places where we see less PrEP availability, less PrEP access. So we have to do a better job of targeting PrEP to those regions geographically, as well as those groups by race or ethnicity who are more likely to get HIV.
Now, when you look at this internationally and you think in terms of PEPFAR and other programs, how do these priorities stack up internationally?
The wonderful thing is that a lot of the priorities that we have domestically are perfectly consonant with the priorities that we have internationally. The same problems that we're seeing in terms of keeping people on antiretroviral therapies or keeping people on PrEP domestically are exactly the same problems that they are dealing with internationally. So a lot of the solutions that we're going to be dealing with domestically can be used internationally and vice versa. And that's something that I think is particularly helpful. The other thing that we're seeing too in terms of the comparability between the domestic as well as the international epidemics is a degree to which we're starting to see this viral storm that's taking place, these competing epidemics. So we not only had COVID-19, but we had monkeypox. We certainly see at least domestically the opioid epidemic and how that affects the HIV epidemic and people living with HIV. And then, of course, internationally, we have malaria and the malaria epidemic, which unfortunately is out of control again because of COVID-19. So for us to get to ending the HIV/AIDS epidemics globally and domestically, we're also going to have to deal in some ways with these competing and overlapping epidemics that are taking place.
I see. Now look, you head up our policy office in Washington, D.C., and the new year is going to bring a new Congress. Republicans will control the House, Democrats will control the Senate. How is that going to affect public policy priorities for you and your team?
You know, I think the first thing that we need to do is to make sure that HIV does not become some sort of kicking ball between both Republicans or Democrats, that it's something that remains neutral territory, both domestically and globally. And thus far, we have done a great job of doing that.
Historically, it's been a bipartisan issue.
Absolutely. It's been a bipartisan issue, and that's something that we want to make sure that we get to keep it that way. One of the ways that we're able to do that is we have a conference that takes place where we invite members of Congress and their their staff to talk about both domestic as well as global HIV and essentially reaffirm their commitment to funding HIV research as well as program work, both domestically and globally. So that's one of the things that we're definitely going to be doing. I think we're also going to be educating new members of Congress about both domestic as well as global HIV programs and how they could help in that effort. We are on the cusp of ending HIV both globally and domestically, and they certainly have a role to play. So those are the types of things that we're going to be engaging with over the next couple of years as we move in with a new Congress.
Annette, let me turn to you and ask about the Treat Asia program, the work that you're doing, and the priorities that you see programmatically.
Two of our top priorities in the Treat Asia program are related to increasing our research on aging and mental health. With regards to aging, in the last 5 years in the Asia Pacific, we've seen a 50% increase in the number of people living with HIV who are over the age of 50. And as they age, their care needs are going to expand. Mental health is a priority because as people with HIV are living longer and HIV becomes a chronic and completely controllable disease, we're starting to refocus on quality of life. So it's not just about surviving, but it's about thriving, living with HIV. And so we've begun to shift more of our work and our training activities for early stage investigators to focus on this intersection between HIV and mental health.
Could you also talk about some of the adolescent and pediatric work that the network is doing and what you think those priorities are?
One of the major challenges that we are facing, and I think something that we're going to see a lot more in the next few years, is the aging up of children who have grown up with HIV. This is called transition, when children transition to adolescence and when adolescents transition to adult care. And the healthcare systems across the Asia Pacific are really not equipped to be able to handle this. And as a result, a number of these young people are being lost to treatment, falling out of care, stopping their antiretroviral therapy, and it's resulting in very serious complications for their health. And it's also affecting the general community in which these adolescents engage with each other, because they're seeing their friends, their peers, really struggling to be able to handle this transition to becoming independent adults. At the same time, they're also needing more complex antiretroviral therapy regimens because they've been developing resistance to the treatments that they have been on. And so these complex regimens often are much more expensive and require the use of more novel antiretrovirals, which tend not to be accessible in low and middle income country settings.
I'm glad you brought up the treatment access question because Greg talked about PrEP and these long-acting injectables. And I'm wondering how that relates, at least in Asia where you are. What do you think, or what do you see on the horizon for the availability of these things?
Even though there are these new novel antiretrovirals that are delivered in different ways, in particular long-acting injectables, sadly, these types of interventions are not going to come to the Asia Pacific region very quickly. In low-income country settings in Africa, you have advocacy from PEPFAR, from the Global Fund, that might be able to bring these therapies there even before middle-income countries in the Asia Pacific. And this is related to what's often called the middle-income country curse, where these countries, many of our countries in the Asia Pacific are middle-income countries. Many of them are not able to access the preferred pricing that would make these kinds of treatments more accessible to people living with HIV here.
Okay, so let me ask sort of a final question, which you all can expand upon however you like. But where do we want to be in 3 years, right? And you can think of that in terms of your program. You can think of it holistically in terms of the AIDS epidemic, any of those things, any way you want to approach it. Greg, let me start with you.
I think in 3 years, we want to be in a place where we have made some demonstrable progress on ending the HIV/AIDS epidemic. One of the problems that we've seen is that funding for EHE has lagged behind both in the Trump administration as well as in the Biden administration, where the White House makes a request for funding, but Congress doesn't enact the funding at that level. It's always at lower levels. We need greater funding for EHE.
And by EHE, you mean ending the HIV epidemic?
Exactly. This is the initiative that President Trump introduced during his State of the Union address back in 2017. Many of our healthcare providers are working double and triple time on COVID-19 or monkeypox or on other issues. So we need to make sure we have dedicated funding for HIV. I think the other thing that I'm looking forward to in the next few years as well is what is the landscape for HIV going to look like without Dr. Anthony Fauci? He has been a force of nature quite literally. And not in the only in the policy space for HIV, but certainly in the research space. So there are going to be many changes afoot at the National Institutes of Health that reverberates across the HIV field as we try and figure out how we fill that vacuum once he retires.
Rowena, where do you want to be in 3 years?
Yeah, I think we've seen that HIV researchers have been heavily engaged in COVID research, and that makes a lot of sense because it was a viral pandemic and HIV researchers knew how to respond to that. I think we need to make sure that HIV researchers re-engage with HIV, not only cure research, but improving treatment and prevention as well. And I think on the cure front, what I'd like to see is us moving towards a point where we're testing more of the interventions in people, but making sure that we keep our eye on testing these interventions in all of the different populations. So both males and females, people of different races, people who are living in different regions around the world because they have different types of HIV circulating, and older people as well as younger people. I think that touches on some of the things that Greg and Annette were talking about, and really make sure that we're advocating for equitable access to cure when we get one.
Great. Annette, what about you? Where do you want to be in 3 years?
In the Asia Pacific region, most of our countries are reliant upon their own domestic funding to support HIV programs. And as a result, we need to be much more efficient in how we deliver programs. And for that reason, I'd really like to see an increase or an expansion of key population-led health services. This is where community organizations are given the authority and the resources and the technical support to deliver HIV prevention and care. And we've seen this in Thailand with programs like the Tangerine Clinic, in the Philippines with programs like Love Yourself, which is now delivering almost 70% of the pre-exposure prophylaxis that's being implemented in that country. And so we know that these are models that can work, and I'd love to see that in more countries across the region.
So once again, thank you guys for joining us. Thanks for your insights very much. We really appreciate it. It's obviously going to be a very busy year ahead and hopefully a very productive time. And thank you to all of you for joining us today. It's your generosity and support and your investment in our work that keeps us going. Together, we'll make AIDS history.